current session under the heading Enabling Investment and Innovation, the critical role of the rule of law. We're very happy to be part of this session. I think it raises interesting questions. The rule of law is critical, which is probably a foregone conclusion, is critical for enabling communities economic opportunity. The presence of a well-functioning rule of law system unleashes the power of investment, innovation, and entrepreneurship. I believe also we are all in agreement about this notion. It makes laws predictable, but also it provides a efficient functioning of the dispute settlement mechanism. Yet we should not see the rule of law in light of what it brings, of what's present, but also of what it excludes. I think it also excludes corruption. It excludes let me put it politically correct, it excludes the unleashed power of the state to close that economic sphere. It also works with different stakeholders to bring about some efficiency argument into the economic system at large. However, there are some questions that I would like to pose at the start to the panel, but also I would encourage you all to pose your own questions to them. The main question is, we have to define this rule of law that functions within the economic sphere. And I always say there are a capital letter rule of law, which is how do we make the rules, how do we agree about making the rules in a given country. But there is small letter rule of law, which is the efficiency argument rule of law, which traditionally that worked in many of the countries that were trying to have the uphill economic growth sort of trip. And for the panelists here, do they have one or the other rule of law in mind when they talk about the rule of law? Are we talking only about bold letter rules which are efficiently applied, predictable, or we're also delving into a democracy argument, so to speak? We have with us 4 outstanding speakers that bring different experiences. So we have the experience of the international development financing and rule of law, advocacy and policy. We have also the private equity perspective. We have the entrepreneurial agricultural perspective, and we have the NGO and water rights and clean water perspective. We're starting by agreement from the macro to the micro, and our first speaker to share with us her views is Christina Pak, who is the General Counsel for the Asian Development Bank, ADB. She specializes in international finance and has been working on multi-sector projects across the South, East and East Asia regions. She has a lot of experience and work in the climate change thematic groups, as well as she has worked with international arbitration as well as policy reform programs across that region. So without further ado, if you would start, my lady, and share with us your views, but also the notion of the capital letter, small letter rule of law as far as the economic sphere is concerned.
Great. It's such a privilege to be part of this important forum. Before I begin, I just want to make a small correction. I am not the General Counsel of ADB, but
Senior Counsel.
A mere Senior Counsel, yes, of the Asian Development Bank. Yeah. I'd like to start by basically setting the context for why rule of law matters to the Asian Development Bank. We're a multilateral development organization, international organization comprised of 67 members, and including about 45 developing member countries. And our reach is quite broad. We extend all the way to, we serve clients in the Central West region, all the way to the South Pacific region and all the countries in between. So the rule of law, we're basically here at this forum and we promote the rule of law because it directly contributes to our mission. Our mission is to promote inclusive and sustainable development to alleviate poverty. And our mission has also evolved over the years to meet the changing needs of our client countries. So over the last 20 years, our mission, basically the issue of the environment, environmental protection, and climate change have become a core part of our operations. And in fact, we have made significant investments into these core areas. So the rule of law basically lays down the legal infrastructure that's necessary to fulfill our mandate. And how the rule of law and how we view what the effective rule of law in terms of doing our development work is that effective rule of law comprises comprehensive legal framework. And that means engaging different stakeholders. And that's why, that relates to our mission of inclusive development. And then the second part really is effective implementation and enforcement of the rule of law. And that includes really providing the capacity that's required to implement the legal framework that we lay down. So I think this goes to your point, Dr. Al-Bashir, about what rule of law means for an organization like the ADB, where our mandate is to engage as many stakeholders as possible, and yet work with the country systems. So our definition, it's pretty broad, but it is an evolving definition to meet the changing needs of our client countries.
Thank you very much. Is there, I mean, would you like to state your views before we move?
Views on how, well...
On the subject, yes.
So, my view, just in the several years that I've been with the bank in terms of doing legal reform with the Asian Development Bank in our client countries, it's we go there. I guess the process of legal reform. Maybe I could kind of tell you about the process and then what that entails. So the process is really to have inclusive engagement. Inclusive engagement means consultations, but yet working with the relevant ministries. But our model has also changed, evolved, because in the beginning, traditionally we worked with mostly line ministries, and we haven't worked with other stakeholders such as private sector. They're becoming a huge partner in our development work, academia, the judiciary. So our legal reform work has expanded to be more inclusive, and certainly working with the NGOs and women as well. It's one of the challenges, yet it's one of the opportunities in bringing together different partners. But it is a challenge because when we do legal reform work, sometimes we do get criticized because we just can't engage with everyone. And it's often hard to balance the state interest with the interest of the other stakeholders. There's also conflicting interests that we have to take into account. So it is it's a evolving, difficult, it is a challenging process, but we do, to the extent possible, we do try to have sufficient stakeholder engagement. In terms of, and then when we lay down the legal framework with everyone's inputs, how to implement it, to involve all the implementing partners, is also challenging because we can't just dump a law and say go implement it. We have to provide the required capacity building that's necessary for all the implementing partners in country. So for example, we're working on a international arbitration reform project in the South Pacific. And the implementing parties, particularly the judiciary, they need to know how to implement this law, what the law says, what the standards are. And then the last, I think the last point is really sustainability of the legal reform is a huge concern for us as well. You know, legal reform is only effective if it really is sustainable and it's taken up by the beneficiaries in our client countries. So coming up with innovative models to sustain the legal reform and to ultimately to get ownership on the ground of the legal reform is also critical to effective rule of law.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is actually Cate Ambrose, who actually will bring the perspective of the private equity and venture capital fund in Latin America. She is the president and the executive director of the Latin American Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. It is a non-profit organization comprised of over 170 firms that control assets in excess of $60 billion dedicated to the Latin American businesses. I believe that the perspective that you bring to us from the private equity, as well as the indicators that could work with your members and how it affects their outlook to that market would be extremely beneficial. And if I may ask also, how would you see corruption in all of this?
Yes. Thank you, Salah. So it's delightful to be here today. So glad to be part of the World Justice Forum. As a reference point, I'm completing my 10-year anniversary at LAVCA. But prior to that, I worked on a United Nations commission called the Legal Empowerment of the Poor. So this is an area, though I'm not a lawyer, as I think the other panelists are not, is of great interest to me. So as you say, LAVCA is a nonprofit organization, but we represent for-profit investors. And our membership is a wide range of global asset managers, from the largest private equity and asset managers internationally down through small venture firms and local investors in countries like Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Argentina. And so from that space, it gives us a great purview to see what is driving global investor appetite into Latin America, where their priorities lay, and also what some of the bottlenecks are for local investors in these markets. And I think it's critical to make this distinction. It's not always completely obvious that private equity and venture capital investors are investing in real businesses. So our member firms invest in everything from infrastructure projects to healthcare, education, financial services, on the venture end, technology and startups, and the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem. So it's not about speculating in markets, and because that, again, they're going to be stakeholders over a fairly long period of time. When a private equity firm goes in to invest in a company, they can expect to be working alongside a business owner or a local partner for a period of minimum 3, 4, 5 years, or as much as a decade. So the framework that they're going to find, both institutionally, your reference to the big letter rule of law, and more operationally in terms of what the contracts are like or the enforceability, is all really important to their priorities. So I guess I would just, at the outset, and having set that up a bit, say corruption is something that's a very important factor for both international and local firms investing in these markets. And I think the critical point I would make is because private equity investors raise money from third parties, from pension funds and others that are trusting their capital with them for a period of 3, 5, 10 years or more, they are absolutely, they will avoid at all costs any kind of an investment or an opportunity or a market where they feel that corruption could be touching or conflicts of interest, or they have to be really, really careful about how they invest their money. And in fact, that's really a fundamental part of their strategy, is to go into these markets or locally to partner with business owners who maybe they weren't paying taxes, maybe there were some part of their business was operating, in the black economy. And their role is precisely to go in to institutionalize, professionalize, and make sure that these businesses are being run in the most transparent way. Ironically, today in Latin America, anyone who's following the news, we've been through a really dramatic couple of years in Brazil with a massive corruption scandal known as the car wash corruption scandal, which has touched businesses, construction, Petrobras, which is one of the largest energy companies in the world, and the extent to which that has touched both the private sector and the relationship with the government has been really dramatic, with some of the most powerful people in the country and some of the wealthiest business owners and billionaires in the world going to jail. I think the reason that it's something that is very relevant for what we're seeing in that market today, when we look at our member firms, they're very remiss to invest in businesses where the government has a reach, because ultimately that crisis that we saw unfold in Brazil was one in which anyone who had relationships and government contracts, there was basically a bribery scheme in place that was feeding back to the private sector. So fortunately, private equity, despite the long reach of that crisis, was not directly affected because of the carefulness around where they're investing and where they're not investing. I'm using that example to jump now to your first reference to the large, again, rule of law in terms of the institutional environment. The great news in Brazil is that the judiciary, which I think is very unusual in developed or emerging economies, has taken the dramatic step of impeaching a president, or starting the process that led to the impeachment of a president. I actually just read yesterday that former President Lula has now been sentenced, which is, again, quite dramatic. He's one of the most popular political leaders around the world, and have sent, again, very powerful people to jail. So again, using this example, you might think that investors would be leaving in droves. In fact, long-term investors, and particularly international investors with deep pools of capital in places like China, Asia, the Middle East, Canadian pension funds, are thinking about where to put their money. They actually see a very positive process in what's going on in Brazil, because they see the institutional commitment and the certainty to have an independent judiciary that is taking these steps will ultimately lead to an environment which, you don't see in other parts of, again, developed and emerging economies.
Your members are a bit weary about going where there is public funds are. However, do they feel bullish about going after such experiences, or they feel bullish about the market in general?
Well, again, it depends. I would maybe make the distinction between the types of investors we're looking at. There are definitely still a number of private equity firms that see particularly an opportunity now, because also in Brazil, the government crowded out a lot of private investment in the past, and so there are new investment opportunities opening up. But it's those that have a window of 5 to 10 years. It's why this issue of the overall environment and the institutional certainty, with a view to not what's happening from this year to next year, or where public markets may be going, but rather the evolution of transparency and judicial certainty. So yes, we see GIC from Singapore, Temasek, the Canadian pension plans, CIC from China, all very, very active. Actually, the Asians particularly active in Brazil right now, but they're not speculating in markets. They're taking stakes in businesses and in projects that have a long horizon because they see the longer term opportunity.
Thank you very much. It seems that the relationship between rule of law and property rights is paramount, and we have with us David Asari Asiamah to talk about property, real estate and property rights, but also to talk about his own experience in AgroMindset Group, which is a company that he established and actually got a lot of attention. So it was among the Forbes Africa Under 30 recipient award, correct?
Yes.
Which is quite impressive. And also we're interested to tell us about that specific experience, but also to tell us how that experience could be widened, because we had a conversation just before this session about entrepreneurs who actually had some good education or some access or some ability to network, and that gives them a head start. Is there a relationship between rule of law and equal opportunity for entrepreneurs who don't really have that support of an Ivy League education or so?
Right, thank you. So my name is David. I'm the founder of AgroMindset, and it's simply a mission-driven firm that is specializing in agribusiness ventures. And our mandate is to run highly profitable farm-based businesses and showcase this know-how to the private sector in an industry-relevant manner. And I would say that globally, the agricultural revolution is being digitized and monetized. Some 30 years ago, 6 men would go to a potato field. One drives a tractor, one drives the plow, one harrows, one plants the potatoes, one covers the soil, another man applies chemicals or fertilizer, another man comes with irrigation equipment. But today, one man just goes to the field, he drives a TM tractor or a New Holland tractor, and he's able to plant, to plow, harrow, do everything on his own. And that shows how things are advancing. But then today's youth remain the only hope to advance this. But then in much of Africa, as far as I'm concerned, not just because of my professional bias, African agriculture is the biggest opportunity in the world. And I say this because of my perspective of creating certain win-wins, that is, eradicating or reducing poverty, solving hunger and malnutrition, creating wealth, generating wealth, which will enable a middle class which doesn't exist yet. So when we watch our televisions and we see all these smallholder farmers with hoes and cutlasses, I see them as the middle class, which doesn't exist yet because they have not been able to tap in certain opportunities. And entrepreneurship is all about risk management and ability to take risk. So consider the late Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, or late back in, times past, consider Dale Carnegie, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison. These men were just normal men that had visions with an uncanny ability to move forward. But when entrepreneurs have the right to space, opportunities remain limitless. So imagine a simple guy that completes school. He's been to school to get educated. He acquires some human capital. Through his social network and surroundings, he's able to create a social capital for himself. He's able to get a job. He's able to make some money. He's able to buy a piece of land. That is a fiscal asset. Beyond that, he's able to access public goods, electricity, to be able to till the land. I mean, this is just a scenario. It could be applied in an IT firm or any other field where I have to buy a laptop to start my IT company. In this case, I have to buy a land to start a farm. Through these interactions, I get entangled with the issues of the rule of law. So consider much of Africa. There are lots of litigation issues with lands. Somebody said that, young man, buy land. They are not making any more of it. So everybody's buying land in Africa. And with that, it becomes a collateral where you can access funding, you can access loans to do what you want to do. So a chief can sell one piece of land to 4 people, and the 4 people have to go to court to defend each other about who bought the land first or who has a right to the property. And as I speak, there are lots of litigation issues in lots of district courts, lots of magistrates' court, lots of courts of appeal and things like that. So I got to Ghana after my postgraduate education in Reading, UK. And when I worked in England, I witnessed the issue of mechanized agriculture, and especially the involvement of the youth. So the involvement of the youth was my confirmation or confirmed my dreams for Ghana. So after my postgraduate education, I returned to Ghana to start farming, turning down lots of employment opportunities in the developed world. But then, when I got to Ghana, there were issues like the cedi depreciating. The dollar was getting stronger against our local currency. So the money I had, I couldn't buy more of the things I needed to do farming. So I set up a logistics as well to help young farmers and new farm entrants to have effective links to market. What do I mean? There was inequitable, incomplete, ineffective links to market. You have $100, which could buy, let's say, 2 bags of protein or soya. The next day, you can buy 1.5 bags. So because of this, we are able to buy in cluster and share. Recently, I'm proud to have brought kind of electricity to our area. When I went there, lots of these farmers were struggling to have power, and energy is a very costly something in Africa. So I said, well, it's going to cost me $4,000 to bring electricity. It's going to cost each of you $3,000 each if you want to do it on your own. So I went to the head of the electricity corporation in the area, and I said, well, I'm starting this thing, I'm doing farming, I'm bringing employment benefits to the youth of the area, I'm contributing to community development. We need electricity in the area. What can you do for us? Then he said, you all should come together as a group, bring a letter, and bring a token of, let's say, $5,000, which is way cheaper than the $4,000 I had to pay, the $3,000 each person had to pay. And because of that, it's a soft skill, it's a negotiation skill that's unconventionally or unconsciously I learned as I went beyond building on my human and social capital. And all these are helping us to do business. I mean, we are not doing anything extraordinary. It's just being smart, knowing where to be at what time, leveraging with what you have and what you don't have, and it's able to help us to get along. But then the little farmer somewhere is a disadvantaged. Imagine this. We all love to eat chocolates. We all love to eat chocolate, and nobody, or some of us don't know where our chocolates come from cocoa. So there's a big company in Europe. They go to Ghana to, let's say, invest. And at the end of the day, the smallholder farmer is cheated. He doesn't get enough money to even take his kids to school or even afford to buy a bar of chocolate. And there are lots of farmers in Africa who grow cocoa themselves, but then they've not even tasted what chocolate is or what it feels like to have it. So a mining company goes to a new area, they realize there are diamonds or there is gold in this part of the land. What do? They go to the chief, acquire some 5,000 acres of land. Meanwhile, there are people with cocoa trees on the land. These are farmers. That is also an entrepreneurial opportunity. But then it's uncertain. So the land is sold to the big guy. The next morning he goes with a bulldozer and clears the land to start farming. And these smallholder farmers are disadvantaged. There isn't an exit strategy or an exit plan for them to exit agriculture, to engage in different dimensions or livelihood strategies. So rule of law becomes something else in this area. And I believe that when these conversations begin to happen and we deepen them, we can disseminate justice and the right participants can be targeted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have raised a very interesting subject that actually was also subject of discussion among friends yesterday about sanctity of contracts, but also the effect of the loss of bargain or of the loss of equilibrium between the two parties into a transaction, especially in light of the example you have said. We'll come back to this.
Right.
Our final panelist today is Minhaj Chowdhury, who is the CEO and co-founder of Drinkwell, which is an NGO that is interested to supply drinking water to the people in India and Bangladesh, which is a big challenge, considering also the population size, and at the same time it talks about water rights. So if you would connect your experience, Minhaj, to rule of law as you see it. I mean, we understand we don't want to go into the technical terms, but how do you see what you're doing in light of rule of law, and how do you support or how does the rule of law system would support what you're doing in terms of providing and supplying good drinking water to the public?
Thank you, Dr. Al-Bashir. So it's an honor to be here. It's my first time to the Netherlands, to The Hague, and it's actually my first time to a law conference of any type. So I'm really enjoying these more kind of policy-driven conversations. So by way of introduction, so my name is Minhaj Chowdhury, and I was actually born in Dallas, Texas, and my parents are from Bangladesh. So naturally, in the summers, I would always travel to Bangladesh. It was part of my mom telling me you have to know where you actually come from. And so my first trip was in 2000. I realized that my grandpa passed away due to lack of access to safe water. My grandpa was in the military. He would travel, before I was born, travel to the different districts wherever he would be posted, and there was naturally no safe drinking water. And so over time, as I would go to Bangladesh throughout elementary, middle school, even high school, I'd see more and more family members fall ill. Some unfortunately would pass away due to something that was pretty straightforward to me when I'd come home in the fall, running water. And so it was always a tough conversation with my parents, asking them like, wait, why is my cousin so sick when my little sister and I are absolutely fine? And they said, well, that's why we moved here. That's why we're in the US, because basic necessities like water, housing, healthcare, education aren't something you could find where we come from. So naturally, I was interested in learning more about why this issue persists despite billions of dollars being spent. And so studied public health in college, and eventually got a grant in the summer to come and try and address this issue of arsenic. So you can't see or smell arsenic, but if it's in your water, within 3 to 5 years, you'll get arsenicosis, which is this incurable cancer-causing disease. And interestingly enough, the issue was something that is unfortunately engineered by the development sector. Effectively, UNICEF drilled 10 million tube wells all over Bangladesh, right in the early 70s when Bangladesh became an independent country. Because at the time, the mortality rate was 49 deaths per 1,000 births. And a big driver of that was the fact that the newborn babies would drink surface water, which is the same source of water where you would have laundry, where you would have cooking, where you'd have people going to the bathroom. And so naturally, the idea was, we'll drill these tube wells that pull water from underground aquifers that have no bacterial contamination. And it was considered a public health success by 2000. But in the mid-2000s, all of a sudden, people started getting these skin lesions, these black dots all over their skin. And what was discovered was that of the 10 million tube wells that were drilled, over half were pulling water from sources that had unsafe amounts, highly toxic amounts of arsenic. And the World Health Organization called it the largest mass poisoning in human history at the time. So Bangladesh, just for context, 160 million people in an area that's the size of the state of Iowa. So it's by population density one of the most densely populated countries in the world. And when you have that level of poisoning, it's very difficult for you to figure out how you can course correct. And so what happened was the development community decided to go on a mission of painting wells red. So the World Health Organization standard for safe arsenic is 10 parts per billion. But what they quickly realized is that there's not enough water quality labs in Bangladesh to actually test for that level of specificity. So they said the standard for our country will be 50. So they went on a mission of painting all these tube wells red. And then when I would go home or go back to my parents' villages, what I'd see is that, let's say you have 10 wells in a village. Let's say 9 are painted red. So there's only 1 green well. So what happens is that, and let's say it's a private tube well owner, all of a sudden, after this activity, you have the entire village lining up in this private property collecting water. And that well owner says, what are you doing here? This is my land. Why is there this big line here? And the people in line say, well, I'm not going to have my daughter drink arsenic-contaminated water. The folks just came in here, they painted these wells, and they said, we can't drink this water. We don't have any alternative source. The prime minister says, well, that's not my problem. Get out right now. It's like, no, I'm not leaving. And then you have conflict. You have violence. And that effectively is what compelled me to really understand, okay, if you have an issue with pure access, how can you remove the arsenic from the red wells so that you can actually have more green wells in that village? And so that was kind of the mandate of Drinkwell when we first started in 2009. And what ended up happening, I was actually in college then, and so I had me and my chemical engineering roommate, Paul. He's 6'2", he's a lacrosse player who'd never been to Bangladesh before. So we come and we get this grant to give away 100 household filters that removes the arsenic from the groundwater. And we call this the Paul effect. What happens was whenever a celebrity like a tall Caucasian person comes to a village, everyone just stops whatever they're doing and just starts following Paul. And what we thought would be a huge issue in convening the community, in getting everyone to buy into the fact that we would upfront finance the capital cost of this household filter, but you would have to take care of the operating costs, didn't become an issue in the sense that everyone already came organically because we had Paul. So we distribute 100 wells, and we have this great festival where we have the local school children doing plays talking about how arsenic isn't contagious, talking about how every week you have to clean the top bucket off with what was iron that would accumulate, because if you didn't do that, the filter would clog up. And so we had everything we thought figured out great. And so come back, it's my junior year of college, and I feel like I saved the world. So I decide 2 years later after graduation to go back and do a Fulbright to scale it up. Go back 2 years later and find out that out of 100, only 3 are still working. So the big question is why? So we found that there was a woman, her name is Shika, and in 2009, it was her job to go door to door to make sure that every mother would scrape out the iron that would accumulate on the top. Well, remember Paul? So at the inauguration festival, what happened was Paul and Shika were standing next to each other when the media came and took a photo of this festival, of this launch. And so when we left, there was a big article in Dhaka saying Hopkins students come to Manikganj, which is the district, to provide safe water. So Danita, CETA, the Danish, Swedish, all these aid agencies read this and say, oh, it's interesting, let's come and let's see what these kids have done. So when they go, remember how I said Paul was 6'2"? Scandinavians naturally are quite tall as well. And so when all of these aid agencies had their team come to the village, all the locals said, oh, look, it's Paul's cousin. It's Paul's mom. Let's all have them talk to Shika. Why else would they come here? And so when they came, all of the local villagers said, wow, everyone's wanting to talk to Shika. And on the flip side, all of the agencies said, wow, Shika's so influential. We must work with her to be successful in this village. So through her, they set up a self-help group for education, they set up a microloan fund, and they did all these amazing things, all through this like kind of very interesting disconnect up front, right? So sure enough, what ended up happening was there was a very rich steel magnate family in Dhaka who had a son who needed to get married. And who better than the foreign whisperer Shika? She was someone who was very well connected in the village, so she got married. And when I go to the village and ask, where's Shika? She was supposed to go door to door to maintain these systems. They say, oh, she's in Indonesia. Turns out, this whole model was flawed from the get-go for many reasons, right? You had, number one, the issue of reliance on one person to make sure the system would work. But more importantly, I call this the Paul effect. It's basically you have an outsider dropped in, and we never could have accounted for this Paul effect risk. But in effect, this is what you have reverberating throughout India and Bangladesh. We're just kind of foreign folks coming in, installing solutions, leaving, and then you have all these socioeconomic issues that come as a result that we never really account for, we never really look at in terms of risk. And so what served as the inspiration for Drinkwell is how do we create local entrepreneurs so that you don't have to have Pauls imported in to solve these problems. So in 2013, what we did was we found a model that we thought works. And basically it's as follows. Basically the local entrepreneur is what we found to be most likely a woman because what we discovered is if you give a woman an asset that can generate cash, that can employ people, they are more likely to sustain that relative to a male. Males just aren't as great at cash management, we've seen. And the specific example I can give you is we had a female entrepreneur who would effectively run a Drinkwell system, which is basically a fixed asset. We have patented technology that removes impurities like arsenic, fluoride, and iron. We give the technology to the entrepreneur. She then sets up the business that's co-financed by us, as well as philanthropy, as well as some buy-in from the local entrepreneur. And basically, they operate this as a business, and we get a servicing fee, which allows us to ensure the proper uptime and minimize downtime of the asset. So what we learned was that when we had male entrepreneurs, you would actually have the system operate in the morning, and it would actually shut down in the afternoon, evenings. Whereas when you had female entrepreneurs, the women would be busy taking care of their kids, sending them to school, and so it would naturally be open in the afternoon/evenings. And this one entrepreneur, what she did was she was able to position the system on the route in which males would come home from the fields. And so this one evening, new customer comes to the site, signs up, and collects a 10-liter jerry can of water, goes home, drops it off, and then goes to what's called the Sangeet, which is a big wedding. It's one of the biggest wedding ceremonies in a multi-day Indian wedding ceremony. And so he had a 12-year-old daughter who had never seen water in a jug like that, because in her whole life, she had only seen water in kulshis, in kind of like steel kind of, and plastic and clay pots. And so she said, well, that's an interesting container. Maybe I can't drink this water. Maybe I should shower with it. So she showers with the water, and at the reception where she performs, she dances with her other cousins, everyone says, oh my gosh, how's your hair so smooth? And she said, oh, well, I showered with this water. And she said, that's amazing. How do I get this water? And sales went up 200% the next month. And so what we learned from that experience was people basically, as much as you want to communicate the health impacts of safe water, aren't willing to pay for something until they can get an immediate gratification, whether it be smoother hair, less briny fish, whiter whites when doing laundry. And so with that insight, we said, this is how you can solve the water crisis. You give local entrepreneurs the technology so they can sell it however which way works in their local context to provide safe water. Now, the moment we had this insight, we were operating in a very unregulated space. So if you think about water, so in July 2010, the UN passed the resolution saying there's a human right to water. Now, if you look at India and Bangladesh, so India has about 1.3 billion people, of which 70% is in the rural parts of the country. And then Bangladesh has about 160 million people, of which 65% is in living in rural areas. So altogether, there's about 1.4 billion people between India and Bangladesh that are living in rural areas. Now, if you look at the law in terms of water rights, in terms of water access, there is actually no regulation of water service delivery when it comes to these rural areas. These areas where you have a US-based company giving technology to otherwise unregistered businesses that are now selling water. And so naturally, I think the first level of order realization we had was back in when the Paul effect was happening, was like, how is it possible that 2 college students can just show up to a village and just provide 100 water filters, 3 of which don't work, without any permissions, without any kind of real regulatory authorities overseeing our activities? And then what we realized is that between 2009 through 2015, that question still lingered. There was no real regulatory authority that was really overseeing what we were doing. We were experimenting. We were doing all kinds of different, rather controversial marketing campaigns where the health ministry said, how dare you market water as something that could be vanity, that could be used for safer ways to shower or to do laundry. And so they threatened us. They said, this is absolutely antithetical to what we stand for. It's completely against the health messaging that all of our partners say. But then we said, your messaging doesn't work. This problem is persisting. And it fundamentally resulted in this big existential question for us where we had to say, okay, clearly a regulatory risk. Now, if we surface this regulatory risk, it's not going to drive a lot of investment to us to grow our business. Because naturally, when you put regulatory risk in your kind of risk matrix for attracting investment, especially for firms that aren't based in Dhaka or aren't based in India, that's probably a huge risk that they won't be willing to take. So then what we realized was if we want to actually operate in this environment, we actually can't go after official pools of capital. We can't actually attract the startup or the different kind of investment funds because it's a non-starter in the sense that we're operating in this unregulated, very uncertain space. Because any day, anyone could throw down a regulation that would completely disrupt our business. So between 2014 and 2016, we basically raised a lot of money from high net worth individuals, from foundations based in the US. And as this question of rule of law kept coming up, we said, we don't have the resources to actually build out a policy and advocacy team to actually inform the regulators. But what we do is inform them of what we're doing. And we'll share our dashboards. We'll share utilization rates of our assets. Today, we have 230 entrepreneurs that are providing over 250,000 people safe water across India and Bangladesh. And the one thing that we always say is at any time, anyone can access our dashboard to actually see how long these people have been provided with safe water. We also provide the water quality reports on a quarterly basis. But even that in and of itself wasn't enough to convince some of the big kind of fund managers who are all about impact to actually invest. And so fast forwarding to kind of like today, I think these like these white spaces are only able to be disrupted by folks who are frankly privileged. Because I went to Johns Hopkins, because I'm from the US, because I had relationships with high net worth individuals, and because I had the ability to kind of speak with foundations, that's the only reason why we're able to exist. It's the only reason why we're able to attract the right form of financing. There are hundreds of entrepreneurs who are much more savvy than I am in Dhaka, in Kolkata, but because they don't have those prerequisite social security numbers and those prerequisite connections, they can't access those pools of capital. So from a just startup perspective, I would say that's the biggest takeaway.
Thank you very much. Very interesting story and also very interesting questions. We have now 25 minutes. We lost 25 starting by actually marketing this session. So I will open the floor for comments, questions, ideas and thoughts. And if you please, just to limit the intervention into a precise comment or question. Please.
Sam Muller from Hill Innovating Justice. I'm intrigued by the question on ownership and sustainability of legal reform in general. And I wonder whether any of the panelists could shed some light on that, because that seems to be quite an important thing. You could reform all you like, but it has to stick. It has to, perhaps come bottom up. I don't know, but any experiences in that regard?
I can answer. I'll give you some insights on how we promote sustainability in our legal reform work with engaging with different stakeholders. So, capacity building is a huge component of putting in sustainable reform. So it's always a huge component of our technical assistance program under our law and policy reform program. So once we put in the legal framework, we're there for several years to really train up on whatever the legal reform is, train up all the partners, government partners, private sector beneficiaries, So I could give you an example in the area of environmental law. So I do a lot of that, how to put in sustainable reform in terms of how do we get ownership on the ground. So that's often involves a bottom-up approach. So we work with academia, law professors, because there's a severe shortage of environmental law capacity in Asia, especially in the greater Mekong sub-region. So we developed this train-the-trainer model. It's not a new model, but it actually requires a lot of ownership. So we trained about 57 professors who are champions. And basically, we asked them, are you willing to lead your own in-country environmental law training program? It's not all substance, actually. It has various methodologies to inspire them, champion sessions. We also bring in other stakeholders like judges and NGOs, local champions. But these initial champions, they basically have to take up the cause of doing their in-country programs. In each country, they link up with the host institution. Then that host institution recruits all these other institutions and brings them together in an event. And then from that event, what emanated is a local network. And basically, it's surprising that they've never met each other before because these networks don't exist. And then we also promote sustainability by helping to form a regional network. So they're not alone to keep up the work because they have to keep inspired. They have to have other motivations to, and then really a reminder why their work is important. So we've helped them form a regional network. And then on top of that, there's always the knowledge component. So we created a knowledge platform. Initially, they don't have the resources. It's ADB funded. But then we're hoping as time goes on, and legal reform, it takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of, it's really on the long horizon. It's not something we go in and we leave. So we have to be there for many years to ensure that it takes hold on the ground and the beneficiary really take ownership. And we're hoping that this network will be self-sustained after years of, after several years. We also have engaged with Chief Justice on the environment. Actually, this is a top-down approach because in Asia, Chief Justices have huge power. They have huge, they can gather basically all the big players. So we've engaged, and this is a new model for us because we haven't engaged with judges. When people think, sustainable development judges, what has that got to do with it? But obviously they implement and enforce environmental laws. But we've got all the chief justices together. So they've been actually very active in creating green benches, doing regional collaboration, and promoting environmental law from the top down. So we do have different approaches to legal reform. And finally, actually, private sector is huge. They're a huge stakeholder, especially in fighting climate change. And I'm really happy to hear our participants and get really good ideas because, public finance simply isn't enough. And I think Dr. Al-Bashir mentioned, what if the state shuts down? They can't shut down because they need public funds just aren't enough. They need the private sector to come in, whether it be fighting climate change or in other sectors like health or education. So with respect to climate finance, most of the countries, they just don't have enough money domestically and even development banks, ADB, our money isn't enough to meet their climate change goals. So they need international climate finance. So that's another way so we're trying to think of innovative ideas to attract the private sector. So we really look forward to it.
It seems to me the real sustainability argument would be to be embraced by the people. And for that, it has to work. So, water has to work, the economic opportunity sphere has to work, and actually settling land disputes and access to farming has to work. And the question becomes, what's the horizon for all of these to work, whether we're talking about private equity to bring out some benefit and for the public to embrace it, or for the water project. To me, it's a non-starter to say access to clean water is needed. However, clearly a policymaker there is terrified by the prospect of having an entrepreneurial access to a dangerous water, which poses a big policy, financial as well as health risk. So, what makes it work?
So basically, since ancient times, the law was made to protect the less privileged. Consider the agriculture sector, for example. We have an issue of increasing population, so we have an issue of diminishing available water per capita. We have an issue of diminishing available land per capita. So in the developing world, where big is not always beautiful, there is the use of big machines to do farming, for example. The environmental law concerning agriculture is that you can farm the whole land, but leave that little area for wildlife. So you grow certain flowers, you grow certain crops to attract the wildlife, the bees and the birds, and the very insects that will continue pollination. In this case, the land is the losing factor in terms of sustainability. You know, I introduced this concept as the law being made to protect the less privileged. So the land hasn't got a mouth. There are two big determinants in agriculture, for example. That is the weather and the politician. We don't have control over the weather, but then we have control over the politician. So these people get to make the bylaws and the rules that have to work. And in the developed world, laws work. I mean, there are people who come, there are inspectors who come to farms to see if you've really left an area for wildlife and conservation issues. In the developing world, nobody cares. And the paradigms are shifting, hands are shifting. It's about who has bulk money, who has the bigger money to control issues. And I believe that as we make, the law's already there, they're already in existence, but then its enforcement is a whole new chapter that we have to open up.
So we have to go to capital letter rule of law when we deal with issues of water and land. We need to talk about the how do we make the rules, and would Africans allow foreign aid institutions or foreign equity funds to talk about that?
Well, currently opinions are divided. Aid hasn't, in a way, worked for much of Africa. Dambi Samoyo has a book that talks about the whole issue on aid and how it hasn't worked and has rather made African nations corrupt. You know, my president, for example, is advocating that Ghana doesn't need aid, we need investment. Years back, Singapore worked so effectively because of foreign direct investment. That is from the 1990s coming downwards, but now it's no longer working. In a way, Singapore shouldn't have been a country that existed because of unavailable natural resources, so they depended directly on foreign direct investment. It worked for them. Now, investors are shifting towards China and India, in Asia, and I have to believe that leaders have to listen to the conversation that is going on. I mean, we can't just create a new chapter. Change is gradual. In as much as change is gradual, we have what works for people, we have what works for the system, and I think that is what we must stick to. There are rules, there are laws, but its enforcement is a whole thing that must be grasped.
Cate, do you have to?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of come back to the question and tie together here. I think, you know, the panels around investment and innovation and coming back to a profit motive is a really interesting way to think about, you know, this issue of sustainability. It's not about, and coming to David's point right now, it's not necessarily about aid. That doesn't mean that there's not a role for aid or there's not a role for development banks and others. But for example, the types of investors we represent are not people sitting in London and New York, flying in and out of places or making a phone call. There are local offices, and again, about half of our membership are local fund managers in these places. They're working with local business owners, and they're absolutely, the only way this model works is when there's an alignment of interest between the investor and the business owner running it, and agribusiness is part of it, water is part. These are all sectors that are being invested in, as is, for example, renewable energy. If you really want to see sustainable policy making or legal change, It's when those people come to the table, all an investor needs to do, you'd be amazed how direct the line is from at the level of even head of state, any country in Latin America, to a large private investor or a significant private investor. And so when there is an opportunity for investment capital to be available for infrastructure projects, water, businesses, et cetera, that is an incredible impetus for policymaking. And then it has to be done well, and reforms have to be done well. And there, is another issue kind of in my notes, is the issue of, the more efficiency topic you were talking about, the smaller rule of law, whether the laws are too complex, whether taxation is too complex, whether labor laws are too complex. But then there's that iterative process of the investors sitting around the table with the policymakers. It's an activity that we at LAVCA are involved in. As I mentioned, we have a scorecard that we publish and we bring people around the table. And it's not usually right the first time. It's a process of years and years. But rather than it being some report or benchmark being handed down by an aid organization, you have truly stakeholders sitting around the table trying to solve these problems and get good regulation in place.
I have another question, but would anybody like to, please?
Thank you. My name is Renford. I'm from Malawi. I wanted to ask a question to the colleague that talked about agribusiness. You portrayed a picture that it seems that there is a big push for big corporations getting on the continent, and they're pushing away what you called the middle farmers. That's, in your view, is a problem. But on the other side, again, you say that because of Africa's challenges, and we need to have all these big corporations come into Africa and push for agribusiness to provide food security. There is a huge concern right now, at the continental level, where people are saying the big corporations are pushing away the smaller farmer. They're making them an insufficient producer. They lose their land. Where do you draw the line? You have not been very clear in that message. I want you to come out very clear. Where do you draw the line? What do you think is good for the continent? I know you talk about investment. It's great.
Thank you very much.
It's great. Yeah.
Well,
Thank you. I think this question is a very important question, and I'm interested also to get the reaction of others on it. Please go ahead.
So I am a big ardent believer of local solutions for local problems. So after the World War II, there were a lot of, bombs or ammunitions for the war, and lots of nitrates. We make bombs out of nitrates, and nitrate is a component of nitrogen. So it was somebody's idea that we should fuel a green revolution with these nitrates because there were tons of them. And that is why we have something we call the Green Revolution. It happened after the First World War. And this is it. Green Revolution happened across the world. It happened and succeeded in China on certain parameters. That is, good infrastructure, good roads, good water, because after the war, there was a lot of famine that was impending. Africa's own didn't respond because our roads were not good, there wasn't enough water, infrastructure wasn't developed. And when you consider the 1950s, lots of the African nations were gaining independence. So Green Revolution wasn't a big beef. I'll link this to GMOs and genetically modified foods and things like that. When such things happen, there must be a local preparation, To date, there are people in Asia that are committing suicide or farmers in Asia that are committing suicides because they are getting into debt. When the Green Revolution happened, the big guys could buy the smallholder farmers' farms and be able to do more farming and, increase the capacity. It's all happening.
David, I want to press you harder on the question. You promised me a rule of law, say it's good for investment. Please come to Africa and invest, and I believe it. And I come and I would say, I want to go into mining. I would put hundreds of millions in investment. Where you're saying that kills the equilibrium, and therefore you seem to suggest that we need to soften that or to equalize that by an intervention of a rule or a state that's not predictable to me to bring the equilibrium. Where do you draw the line? Because I would argue that that's against the rule of law. That kills the sanctity of the contract. I see the social dimension. And I believe our colleague's question is, where do you draw the line? Because you seem to say, I don't want to respect the sanctity of the contract. Willie, what do you think?
Well, you see, this is the investor or the big guy coming has spotted an entrepreneurial opportunity. He comes in with an entrepreneurial resource that has the propensity to create.
He's coming with money. He's coming with money that we want. He's coming with investment.
But then that is when the local laws have to protect the local citizens and indigents of the land. Because if we are just looking at money, at the end of the day, the foreign guy gets all the benefits, and we get our own people poor. We get them deprived of their own physical assets, of their own lands, and we make them more poor. But then I believe there are local institutions. If I believe in partnerships. I believe in partnerships working a local, a big organization, find a local company that is synonymous with their mission statements, and through mergers and acquisitions and partnerships, and getting to do things right from the initiation of such concept, rather than just going in to buy. Because the chiefs and the big guys and the politicians will always want kickbacks. They will always let you have your way. But then we should look at local institutions that work.
Yeah, maybe the sustainability argument would be an answer. Minhaj, do you want to participate in this?
Sure. So I think
yesterday, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yesterday, in a panel about big data, they said unregulated, it means it's legal. The question that actually is being posed in this question, but also in the water question, that unregulated, it means it's illegal, it's outside. Because if somebody comes to unregulated activity and would say, I am entitled to the benefits of the water, the returns, the money, or the mining venture, probably it is illegal.
Right. I think so. So I think there's two things. The first is if you're a foreign investor that's going to flow capital into a country, in terms of the business model, there's a difference between providing just the product and letting the local utility company, the local entrepreneur, then deliver that product to the end user as a service, or you actually going the full mile and touching the end user yourself. So when we first started, we were going to be the latter. We were going to go the full mile and deliver the water to the end users. And that naturally, unregulated meant illegal in that case, because it's this US company that's now setting up shop in these villages that are poisoned, providing, quote, safe water. And where is the cash going, the revenues? And as much as I say that it's going to go to finance growth, there's no real mechanism. We're not a publicly traded company, you can't really audit us, and if you did, there was no real statutory authority for you to do that. So then what we had to do is we said, okay, we can only be a technology provider, and we need to work through the utility companies, through the local service providers, and that is the ultimate barrier at which point we can no longer proceed. And it worked out in the sense that in water, the further you are from the end user, the higher your profit pools, the more margin you can make on your product. Makes sense, right? Because if you're selling water to end users and making like a 30 to 70% margin, you're effectively privatizing water, you're profiteering off of a crisis, right? But then if you're selling your technology at 50 to 70% margin, the utility that might sell that water, they get subsidized, they have tax bases that can subsidize that. So it's that kind of thinking about profit pools, thinking about the value chain, what the implications are if you want to maintain a particular profit margin in a certain activity that informed our thinking. But I would say that's kind of the first thing. And then the second thing I would just say is like, we realized that naturally, like as a startup, you are working in a very risk-filled environment, and your funders, whether they be early stage folks or later stage growth capital, they have different risk tolerance levels. So it's all about kind of figuring out who has the risk tolerance that matches with your stage of the business. And that's where we found that there's a lot of interest from informal capital, high net worth individuals, philanthropic folks. And I guess the hope is over time with working with the legal folks, by the time your company gets to that growth stage, organizations that are represented here on the panel can help form the legal infrastructure to where those bigger guys can come in. That's kind of my idea.
You know, I would like to get your views on this, but it seems to me that rule of law to be protected by political and social sustainability is scary. I mean, we're saying we need to have the sustainability that's produced by the social inner workings in a country, which would remove predictability, in my opinion. Please go ahead.
I was just going to add that, you know, basically when you do business and there's uncertainty, there's gray areas, businesses will, you know, build in that risk. They'll price that in, so it becomes more expensive to do business. And actually, legal uncertainty is bad for business. And I think, you know, this entire conversation goes to what is effective, you know, rule of law making. And it's, you know, it is really taking into account local interests of the smallholders, interests of the business. And that is often challenging, but, you know, if you're a stakeholder, you're interested, you have to get involved. We attempt to do that. I mean, ADB, we're a facilitator, so oftentimes when we do legal reform, we do help bridge the gap because governments aren't going to reach out to everyone. I mean, they just can't. They don't have the capacity, so we will bring in, you know, whoever the stakeholders are, whether it be private sector. But the private sector is calling for legal certainty. They need rule of law to invest. So rule of law is critical to investments. And we just also, at the same time, we need to think of innovative ways to, you know, to involve everyone or to implement the law.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's kind of a bigger context around this that we're coming to also, which is the question of the paradigm of the past, the big, call it multinational, the big foreign investor coming in and taking up the land.
Yeah.
From where I sit, I see just a fundamental change in that mindset. One of the core beliefs or understanding of any investors, you must be local. You absolutely must have a local partner. So again, you can't fly in and out. You're working with a local business or a local owner. And then there's been a huge push over the last decade around, there's kind of two buckets of terminology. One is ESG, environmental, social, and governance practices. I guess it's like corporate social responsibility for corporations, but for investors. And also the idea of impact investing, which both your endeavor and, you know, your endeavor could be described probably as impact investments. And so, again, the types of investors and most investors today, you know, need to think when they're going into these markets about they have no choice but to think about local stakeholders, especially when you're talking about sectors like renewable energy or mining. In Colombia, this actually quickly goes to law. In Colombia and Peru, in both of those countries, there's something called consulta previa, which is written into the legal code, which is when you want to go into a community to do a mining project or something that's going to disrupt, you know, the environment, you have to hold a consultation process with the local communities and get them to sign off on it. So I think we're past, at least, I'm sure it's not true everywhere, I'm sure it doesn't work perfectly, but we've now moved into a world where investors and companies, when they're looking at local projects, have no choice but to have local partners, to think about and to, you know, think about the local communities or what kind of an impact that's going to have. Otherwise, there's legal liability, there are lawsuits, you know, I mean, there is a lot of vulnerability for investors if they don't take that into account.
I think we're coming to the final moment of the session. I have a question. I would like you to prioritize one area that you think would be a priority to work on. If we're looking at this as partnership between the public and private sector, would it be work on sanctity of contract, taxation, finance, or capacity building? Which will you pick first?
I would go with capacity building.
Capacity building. What would you?
I would go with capacity building.
Capacity building.
Yeah.
What about transparent? Did you say about, what was the?
I didn't mention transparency, but if you
I
want
was
to
like
add it.
transparency of laws. If you say, what did you say, taxes?
I said taxation.
Uh-huh.
I said sanctity of contract, capacity building, and finance.
Well, I mean, it's all interrelated. I would say transparency and high quality laws and rules that for implementation.
I would say sanctity of contracts.
Sanctity
I think
of
it's a prerequisite.
Thank you very much for being such a lovely audience. I have to ask you to give a round of applause to our panel. And I second, thank you very much for being such a great panel. I really enjoyed this very much.